I have built a lot of RGB'd out gaming PCs, and every single time I question, is it really worth it? And that's for a couple of reasons. One, you actually lose performance by using RGB fans. No, that doesn't actually gain you 15 frames. Instead, more than likely, it's going to contribute to a worse sound or, in some cases, a slower fan. And this is for a number of reasons. One, the material to make it transparent is just not as rigid as some of the more advanced materials that are coming out today. And so you often have to choose, do I want to have a flashy PC, which most people do choose, or do I want to do something more muted and more performance focused? Not only that, but hooking up RGB fans sucks. Like the amount of cabling that goes into making a PC like Supernova or my current build actually work is just ridiculous. It's a process that I loathe doing every single time. So I don't know why I'm putting myself through this, but we're gonna start testing some fans on this channel. And I think the best ones to start with might be these. Because when it comes to performance or RGB, Lian Li said, why not both? So today, let's take a look and actually fully test out the Lian Li Uni Fan SL120 V2 RGB. Yes, it's a long name, but that's because there's also a couple of other SL120s, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But first, the Pi needs to go to the top of the screen and do its thing. Hello and welcome. My name's Wolfie. You're watching GreaterThanPie, and thank you, yes, you, for coming. So the SL120s are kind of famous, not infamous, for being the first fan without power connectors between them. It uses a lock and slide connection that we're gonna take a look at because it's the first time I've ever actually seen it, but they had a couple of big things going for them right out of the gate. For one, there was RGB on both the front and the back of them. And then they also didn't have RGB on the blades. That came later in the further revisions of the SL120s. Now there are currently 3 SL120s. There's the non-RGB version, which comes in at the lowest price, but supposedly has the best performance. There's this version, which is a compromise between the two, where there's RGB on the frame, but not on the blades. And then there is an RGB'd out super flashy one with like an infinity mirror on the inside of the screens and then like chromed out. It's super, super, super flashy, but it's really cool looking. Those are the most expensive, but also probably the worst performing because they had to switch the blades out to something that would actually work with, well, RGB. So I think the first thing we should do is actually open up one of these boxes. Now this is a starter kit, comes with 3 fans and a controller, which both of these are starter kits. And I picked up this kit for around $81. It does vary in price a lot, unfortunately, and that's mainly due to the fact that this is such a popular fan kit that they're out of stock quite frequently. And if I can get this open, we'd get into the box. Okay, nice to know that there's a 2-year warranty. That's actually right there on the front of the box. And all right, so up top, we've got connector of some kind, connector of some kind, connector of some kind, connector of some kind. And then the magnetic locking mechanisms, which I believe on the version 2s, these can go either direction, which is pretty cool. And then our fans. I'm assuming, I'm assuming that all these connectors are if you want to run the fan without having them daisy chained together. We've got screws to install everything. That's nice. The fans themselves, and then this should be the control box, which it looks like it is. Okay, so we got this little control box, had a little peel on there, and then there's also another one. Nice looking. So coming off of it, we've got 2 SATA power connectors. Well, that's interesting. Double-sided tape to double-sided, actually this feels like a magnet. This is a double-sided magnet. This is not tape. So we got a magnet here that attach it to the steel back of the case, and I'm sure you could double-side tape it if you wanted to. USB connector sense wire for PWM. Okay, so this is PWM and RGB. I'm assuming this goes, yeah, right in there. And that will allow us to take over from Lian Li's software if we so chose to, and control it via the computer's RGB, which I do appreciate that Lian Li has. And then there's also a USB connector to connect it to USB. So this has got to be in a weird spot in your case. Cables aren't particularly long. I mean, I guess they really don't have to be. You can station it probably close to like the bottom and then route it and should be good. We'll see. Now let's take a look at the actual fans and see how this interlocking thing works. So this is the fan. And I gotta say, it's a very pretty fan. It's also got a peel. That is actual metal. Okay. So this is a very, very intricate fan design. We've got rubber mounting, so that's got vibration prevention right there. There's our two sides here for locking and interlocking. I like all the accents on it. It feels like a quality product right out of the bag, which is good because they're kind of expensive. It's like real stiff. We're doing it right. You line up the keys and then you, there we go. So just like that and just like that. Now that makes that real easy to install. That's rigid. That's good. There's like no real flex here. This only extends to another one of these. So if you've got your other ones hooked up to keep it to one cable, you use this. So that's why it's positioned that way. And then for this, you use this cable, which I just demoed. You stick it in where it holds down the pogo pins, like so, and that's to protect the pogo pins. It's actually not to do anything like trick it or something. You push that in all the way. That is your cable that runs off into your case, which this is a much longer cable. So you can put that towards the top, put it this way, run it to the back, and run it to your box, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. This is set up for the 3 fans in the front or on the side intake, and then the ones on the top. So if I were to set this up in my current case, this would be in the AIO, this would be in the intake. Now, and that's to the box. So you've got some room to work with. It's not too bad now that I know what this cable is for. But your biggest issue is definitely going to be planning out if you've got a 7 fan setup like the one that I have, having that extra cable that will go there. But 2 cables to connect RGB fans is already impressively low. So from here, let's take them to the test PC and actually test them. The main selling point of these fans are their ease of installation. That is the one thing that I believe these fans should do well. And they do. Being able to install 3 fans at a time is absolutely the easiest way I've ever installed fans. Not only that, but being able to run a single cable to a single control box makes things so much easier. In this setup, I would have to run 7 RGB cables and 7 PWM connector cables into either its own hub and an RGB splitter to make it all work. Instead, I now have dedicated lines to each group of fans. Now you can connect up to 6 into a single chain. Unfortunately, because I am using a radiator for the first group of 3, it didn't really make it possible for me to actually group them together. The radiator has its tubes kind of going in a way that makes it so that I really can't use the extension cable in either direction. And the version 3 does fix one issue where it centralizes the connectors so that you can actually have the cable running in either direction, but it still wouldn't work if the tubes of your radiator are in the way, or if there's a specialized fill port for the manufacturer, such as on the EK radiator AIO combo. The control box itself is smaller than your typical 2.5-inch control box, and while it does have a lot of extra cables, not all of them need to be plugged in if you're not using certain functions. That being said, it does have a rather large amount of cables going to it, but a lot of connectors. You can connect 4 different chains of 6 fans, which already exceeds pretty much any case that I can think of. But there's also an additional 2 accessory LED connectors, which I had to use for the single fan that is in the back of the case. That one did not come with anything to connect it to the other fans, but since I had the starter kits, I definitely had enough that if I really wanted to, I could figure out a way to daisy chain it together. Overall, everything went into the case pretty easily, and it ended up being a fairly painless installation process. And compared to how the old way was with installing RGB fans, I kind of don't want to go back. And I'm sure the next test PC that I build is going to probably revolve around using fans that connect like this. So we've completed our testing, and now let's actually talk about it, because these fans performed in a very interesting way, and it could be beneficial or negative depending on what you're going for. So our control fans were the EK Vardar RGB. I think it's literally the old version of those fans. So they're a little bit older, but they were high static pressure, high performance fans, even at the time when we originally bought them. And when you compare the SL120 V2s to those fans, well, they're within a margin to being slightly worse in some aspects. So let's go over the hard numbers first, and then we'll talk about it. So at idle, our room temperature was set to 20 degrees Celsius. Our CPU temperature on our control fans was 32.1. Our GPU came to 27. Our junction temperature came to 32 degrees. Case 21.9, and this was running at an idle sound of 42.6 dBA. Now, our SL120 V2s at idle were at 36.4 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Celsius on the GPU, a junction temperature of 34 degrees Celsius, a case temperature of 22 degrees Celsius. Now, looking at these basic results, you'll notice that the CPU actually was a lot warmer at idle than it was with its default configuration. And that is probably due to the fact that the fans that we did use originally were designed for radiators. And our current cooling setup is an AIO setup, which means that those fans should favor the CPU in this type of situation. But it's not as clear as you would think. Also, you'll notice that the actual sound profile of the SL120s is already lower than the Vardars, and that also continues. Now, we did do a GPU and a CPU stress test, but I do have to kind of preference the GPU stress test with something a little bit interesting about the SL120s. So the SL120s, to have RGB control and fan control, do require a special piece of software, which could be kind of annoying if it weren't for the fact that it's actually very well designed. And you can kick the control back to the motherboard. The reason that it has to be done this way is mainly due to the fact that the interconnected RGB LEDs have to be addressed sort of in a specific and special way. Unfortunately, this means that this does score very low on our RGB compatibility score, but it does score a lot higher when it comes to its actual functionality. So going back to the GPU test, we actually ran this a couple different ways using the SL120 software, because believe it or not, you can actually set it to target either the CPU or the GPU, which is actually very important, because if you are targeting a GPU load and you have everything set to cool by the CPU, you won't get as much performance as you would if you were to target the GPU for all of the cooling. Additionally, we were able to set these fans to full speed right in their own software, which does work as a beneficial piece to testing these fans out. So let's get into the GPU testing. We use 3D Mark Speedway and specifically the stress test. The most important number is this consistency percentage at the bottom. This right here determines whether or not the temperatures in the case will actually affect your GPU one way or the other. Our control had a CPU temperature of 46.3, a GPU temperature of 62 degrees Celsius, junction temperature of 78 degrees. The case did go up to 22.2 degrees Celsius. The decibel level of this while running at its stock configuration was 46.1, and its stability was 99.5. At the standard speeds for the SL120 V2s, the CPU temperature was 50 degrees Celsius, the GPU was 64 degrees Celsius, the junction temp was 76 degrees Celsius, the case temperature was 23 degrees Celsius, the dBA was 45, and the percent stability was 98.6. And that definitely shows that in its stock configuration using the standard speed, you're going to lose some stability and some performance, although it does count as a passing grade in 3D Mark still. But if you target the GPU, specifically in the software, it drops the temperatures on the CPU, as crazy as that sounds, to 48 degrees Celsius. The GPU temperature dropped down to 63 degrees Celsius. The junction temperature, 77 degrees Celsius. Case, 22.6 degrees Celsius. The dBA, 45. And the stability went up to 99.6%. Meaning, yes, by just simply rearranging things to focus on the GPU, you get a better result in a workload that focuses primarily on the GPU. Now, for high speed, running it at full tilt, 48 degrees Celsius. GPU was 63 degrees Celsius. Junction temper actually ballooned to 82 degrees Celsius. The case also went up to 24 degrees Celsius. The dBA was at 49, and we did score a 99.4 in the stability area. Looking at that results, you're gonna see something a little bit weird resulting with the full speed. Why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with physics. Fans are only effective up to a certain speed, and more than likely these fans are less effective at 100% than they are at, well, their regular speeds, just, well, adjusted to focus on a specific part of the PC. That being said, it is within a margin of error of our GPU focus, though the junction temperature being higher is a bit concerning. And now for our final component, we did do a CPU test because we are putting these fans right against the radiator just to see how this might perform. And much like you can probably allude to, there was some performance degradation. So the control ran at 78 degrees Celsius. The case was 21.9 degrees Celsius. dBA was 54, and it had a score of 14,732. The SL120 V2s actually ran at a lower temperature, interestingly enough, of 73.9 degrees Celsius. The case did go up to 24 degrees Celsius. The dBA did stay below 50 and was at 48, and that scored 14,326. Running everything at full tilt, we got 73.9 degrees Celsius. Again, the case stayed at 24 degrees. The dBA went up to 50, and we scored a 14,649. Now, the weird thing about these results is in 3D Mark, that is within a margin of error. And it seems that our big conclusion is that while the EK Vardars are the better performing fan, the SL120 V2s are not lagging that far behind them. Now that the unboxing, the testing, and the install is all done, how do I feel about these fans? Well, I actually really like them, but for a couple of subjective reasons. For one, the RGB is damn near the best RGB implementation I've ever seen. Their performance is good enough that I wouldn't really be that opposed to using them in a high performance system, but it's mainly their appearance and their ease of installation that actually makes them, well, unique and useful for me. They are easily the best looking fans I've ever seen through tempered glass. And in an RGB setup where you are planning around having a lot of different RGB cables running to different places, having a fairly unified system that allows you to just connect a single cable to any of the chains of fans does go a long way in simplifying the process. Additionally, when you're installing 3 fans in a single spot, being able to line up all of the fans at once will ensure that the install goes a lot easier than if you were to install one at a time. The biggest downside with the install of these fans seems to be with the cable, which I believe they fixed in the version 3s, where it can only go in really one direction and it sort of can and cannot work in all scenarios. So the only reason that my front and rear fans are not synced to a single cable is just because I couldn't make it work in the current setup. Additionally, there is something weird when you buy a single fan from the same line. They don't come with the cables to link them together to the other devices. Instead, they actually come with a separate cable which has a separate spot inside the hub that comes with the fans. Overall, I really do like them. I like how they sound and I like how they look. But there is sort of a problem with the high speed mode inside their software. That high speed mode has a rattle, and I don't know if it's all of the fans or just a couple of the fans that are rattling, but there is a rattle that is caused specifically by entering the high speed mode and being in a certain RPM range. What's funny is full speed mode actually doesn't have the problem. So it's just in a small section that isn't affected by the standard performance, but is only affected by the high performance. Another sticking point for me is how unflexible the actual software is. It is good software, but while it does tell you awesome things like GPU, CPU temperature, resources, it's effectively another resource monitor, and it allows you to control the RGB, what direction everything goes, how it all looks on each of your fans, RPMs, silence, performance, and standard performance modes, GPU and CPU targets. It also is unfortunately required for you to pass off control to your motherboard so that your motherboard can control everything. But it only is worse when you look at how the motherboard's RGB implementations don't actually show up very well on the fans. I have a system that I have completely decked out to be one piece of RGB software, and that works with the EK Vardars. But if I kick over motherboard control and use the same razor green that is currently being displayed right now on that case, it will not accept that signal, and for some reason it turns white. So it could be a bug in the system. It could eventually be fixed, but for right now, it doesn't seem that motherboard control is really that great. They're a little pricey, but they're not outrageous, so I would recommend them. So overall, I think that they're impressive. I do like them, and I'm definitely gonna be using them in a build really soon. That being said, they are not going to be replacing my current best testing fan. And in our next test system, I believe I'm gonna have two types of fans in there, ones that are RGB and ones that are not, so that in the future we can test the RGB and the non-RGB separately. As an RGB fan, it performs well. So leave a comment down below what you think about these fans and what fans you wanna see me test next. As long as I can get them in a set of 6 or more and they fit in a 120mm slot, they can be tested. And I am looking forward to testing even more fans inside this case. So if you're not subscribed, get subscribed for even more fan testing, CPU testing, GPU testing, and the like. And I will see you in the next video. Wolfie, out.